Good afternoon. I guess I drew the short straw, so here I am. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lori Nix. I'm from Murdo, and I'm going to share a little bit of our story of how we converted farmland to grassland and a little bit of the story behind it. I can't do it in 30 minutes, so I'm going to shorten things a little bit. But our story's not right, or it's not wrong. It's just our story. And what worked for us may not work for you. But some of the things that we did or some of the ideas behind them may work for you and help you to move along in whatever journey that you choose. So I'll just start back in 2008. Our transition started with a crisis. It was a labor crisis. We had 19 different enterprises. We handled in 2008. That's at 16 years ago. We handled just under $1 million in income and just under $1 million in expenses. I mean, that's just how it went. And so when we go to the bank, we'd have to borrow money to pay our interest. And you know, that's not very sustainable. And so the writing was on the wall, and we knew that we needed to do something different. So I'm going to start by saying a few things about how we were able to be what's been successful, at least this point, is that we had built relationships along the way, good relationships, and if it wasn't for those relationships that we'd been building, I don't know that we would have been near as successful. And so we built relationships with our lenders, and they've talked about that here today. We built relationships with our accountants, and everybody in the equation that we had good relationships with, and they were our friends. And so when it come time to really analyze things, we had people that we could surround ourselves with that could really help us. And so we did that. We could see that our ship was really low in the water, and it was taking water on, and so we had to change that. We had to stop the bleeding, as they say. So we put together a group of people, our local banker, farm credit individual that we were good friends with, and FSA individual that I become good friends with. And we brought all of our information together, our finances, and the farm credit people sent them to Omaha and run them through their number cruncher and sent them back and said, hey, you got some problems, and which we knew. And so size and scope was some of it, but we were also doing some other things that we're in an unwritten, unlegal partnership. It wasn't illegal, it just wasn't legalized. Partnership with my parents. And so as we would go forward in our business, we would say, well, you can pay for half and we'll pay for half, and then it won't be hard on anybody. That gets you in trouble really quick because everything had to come out of the same ranch kitty in the end. So we were doing some of that, and we're spending money in areas that we shouldn't be. So this was in 2008. In 2010 is when we finally pulled this team together and decided that we need to make some changes. And so one of those changes that was recommended is that we sit down with my parents, who were in their 70s at that time, were still really involved in the business, and talk about what would come next. And after a lot of tears, honestly, by not just them, but us as well, my wife and I, and my wife Lori and I, and my parents, they decided that they would step back away from the business, turn it over to us, and they would become advisors. It was the best move that we ever made for all of us. And so it wasn't completely well received to begin with. So we separated the land from the livestock, from the machinery. We formed a partnership and put all of our land in a partnership. We leased, pay rent to the partnership, and then we slowly bought the cattle that they owned, and we had our own cattle, and we leased the machinery as well. So that was kind of what we started out on. My mom was on board with it right away. My dad was a little slower to get on board with it, but he saw the necessity, and the question was asked him by our farm credit individual that arbitrated this, And I was so thankful that he was willing to do that. I think he cried too. And my question was posed to my dad, do you want to see this business survive? And my dad's answer was unequivocally, yes, I do. So this was the journey that we started on, and there was some legal things that took place. We met with our accountant, we met with our lawyers, and we set this all up. And then in 2012, we got this all in place, then we were in charge, so to speak. But we didn't use that, as any holdover on anybody. We continued to use my parents as advisors, and we had a really good relationship with my parents because we'd built that over the years. And so when I get through just telling our story a little bit, I'm going to share some what I would call nuggets that we've learned over the years since we started this transition where we are here today. And so one of the things that we've developed a really good relationship with my parents as we did things 50-50. When it was split down the middle, we would always give them the bigger half because nothing splits down the middle, right? And so we did that over a lifetime, and they would try to give us the bigger half, and we wouldn't let them, we'd give it to them. And so this was just kind of this ongoing thing where we always tried to outgive each other. And that's one of the greatest things you can do, is to be generous, to be a giver, to outgive the people around you. It will come back in great numbers later in your life. And in times like this, when we were in a bad situation, it really came back because my parents completely trusted us. They trusted us with all that they'd worked for the previous 60 years or 55 years. So that you don't buy that with green stamps. You got to work a long time to get that established, which we had. And so we started this journey. My wife and I sat down and said, what are we going to do now? We've got the information, we've got a hold of the reins, what are we going to do? So we sat down, we talked about what we'd done in the past. A lot of times we'd go through our detailed cash transactions, and we would say, let's cut 4 or 5% off each one. That'll gain us quite a little bit of room. And then as we did that, well, if you had an $80,000 fertilizer bill, and you cut 1% off that, you might end up with $3,000 or $4,000, that you cut. And you do that with each one of them. We found out that we're not going to go very far very fast. So we got to look at that and say, what could we really do to make an impact? And we decided the best thing we could do would be to cut out line items. So we asked ourselves, how do we cut out line items? Well, the only way we could do it was to change our business. And one of those was to get out of the farming business, because that's where most of our high dollar line items were. So we thought, well, okay, so that means we'll have to plant all of our grass back, or our farm ground back to grass. We had about 3,500 acres, and that was going to, we thought, well, we set a plan up. We thought we could do this in 3 years. It took us 6. But either way, we had a plan, and our plan was that as we didn't need machinery anymore, we would sell it to pay for fencing, water lines, tanks, grass plantings. And we also brought in some folks that are in this room to help with some of those plantings and things as well, and the fences. And so it was a collaboration. But so the slides are mostly going to be for me. These are some of the questions that we asked ourselves. What do we want our life to look like? So, that was a really important question for us. We were overlapping all of our enterprises, and there was, we'd have to start one before one was even through. And that was almost year-round, so we didn't want that anymore. And then we set up our goals. We wanted more family time. We wanted less debt. We wanted less work-related stress. We wanted to improve our land. We wanted to stop writing out big checks. Lori would she'd write out a big check to fertilizer, chemicals, or something, or insurance, and she'd look at me and say, is this going to work? Is this going to work out? I'd say, oh, yeah, it should, if it rains and everything goes well. Well, things doesn't always rain and things don't always go well, as we had found out. So we wanted to stop writing out big checks, and we wanted to raise a healthy product. and we wanted to leave our piece of the world better than what we found it. And so part of that was getting my parents on board, even though they weren't in control anymore. They still needed to be on board with what we were doing, because my dad was pretty controlling, as most of us are, and he, wasn't quite understanding what we were going to do. So we told him that we wanted to plant all the farmland back to grass. And we told him kind of what we had plans to accomplish this, and he was pretty reluctant. So what we did is we had to start to strategize, and that's one of the gold nuggets, is most of us need to strategize more than we do other things. Strategy is key. So we started the transition on the other end of the ranch, where my dad couldn't see it. See? And so we started way back there, 9 miles away, and we started, and some of our goals were to put 3 years of cover crops and cattle on all of our farm ground, because our farm ground had become pretty much sterilized. We'd been we started no-tilling in the late 90s, so we'd been no-tilling quite a while, actually it was in the early 90s, and so we'd been no-tilling quite a while, and so we'd been putting a lot of chemicals and salt urea-based fertilizers and things that tend to sterilize your soil, but they'll sure grow a monocrop. So we had to put life back in our soil, so that was part of our goals. And we had a 3-year plan, like I said, but it didn't go quite in 3 years. So as we did that, and my mom was okay, she was on board right away, and my dad started watching this, and he'd drive over and look at what we were doing, and then he could drive back home and not have to see it. And his road to town was about 5 miles from our ranch. And so we left those fields along the road that he drives to town to the very, very last, so that he could still see where we were out there doing a little bit of farming. We were planting cover crops, so we were doing a little bit of haying, a little grazing, and so he was watching this take place. And that was all strategy. And so along the way, here's another nugget. This was critical. So in the early stages, I would go down, and I had coffee with him about every morning at 6 or 6:30. And I would go down, sit with him, have a cup of coffee, and I would say, Dad, I got an idea. See what you think about it. I'd share the idea, and then I would say, but it probably won't work. And he'd say, okay. And so we'd talk about something else, and I'd leave and go about the day, and he'd call me back at 1 or 2 o'clock and say, I was thinking about what you said. I think that maybe could work. And then he'd tell me how it could work. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's strategy. That's wearing different colored hats. That's all. So we've talked about it since then, and he's okay with it. And so he became part owner of what we were doing as an advisor. And he had good ideas, better than mine a lot of the time. And as it went along, and he could see what we're doing, and we started selling equipment. He was a little leery of that. Well, aren't you going to need that again? I'm like, no, we got through with that. We're done with that portion of things, so we'd sell it, and then we'd put some fence in. And one of our sons was working for us full-time then, and he was out building fences in the hot sun for $10 an hour every day. And I just drove by one day and I said, this isn't right. So I said, hey, how would you like to start a fencing business? And we'll give you the first 15 miles that we have, and we just figure out what rate you need to do. We'll loan you the money to start with to buy whatever you need, a skid steer, a digger, whatever you need to build a fence. So he said, well, I'll have to talk to my wife about it. So they did, and he decided, yeah, they'd do it. So they went and bought a skid steer and the stuff that you build fence with. And so he started building fence for us along one of the main roads, which was a mistake on my part. Because it was just in a couple days, people were driving by and stopping saying, could you come build fence for me? And he'd say, well, I kind of committed to my dad here for 15 miles. And so he'd call me up and say, do you know which field you're going to need when and how soon and all this? And I'd say, well, I kind of got an idea. He says, well, could you work with me? And I said, sure. He said, well, I got so-and-so that wants a couple miles of fence built. Could I work that in? Well, I said yes, and he did. And I'd have to call him like 2 days before I needed a fence built and say, hey, we kind of need this fence. But so it turned into a really good business for him, which he's still doing today. And he starts fencing. Actually, I think he started out on the fence line like today or tomorrow. He's going to start out again on the fence line. He's been doing other projects. So it was a great business for him, and he built fences last year clear up into December. So, and I pay him same thing as everybody else pays him, but I just can't get him to come build my fences. And I tell him, that's fine, you'll get me when you run out of other work, because you got to get it while it's out there, So that was kind of an offshoot. And so there were some things that started this as well. And I can't remember all my dates exactly, but right in the same time period, and we were calving, we calved our heifers in February, which we're calving some now, but by mistake, and then our cows in March and April. And we were having a snowstorm, and it was brutal, like a lot of people know. And Chris was carrying calves in, and I was opening the gates for him, and I was doing some of that too. But I said, and we were watching cow getting ready to have a calf. She'd be walking across the trail in the slop, and it was awful. They had to go through it just like we did, the cows did. And so I said, could you handle things out here for a little bit? I want to go talk to my dad. And so that advisor. So I went down, sat down with my dad, and I said, I got a question for you. I said, why do we calve this time of the year? And he sits back in his chair and takes a drink of coffee and says, well, I'll think about that a little bit. I'm not really sure. And then he says, I think one of the main reasons we wanted to be through calving when we started to go farming. So we wanted to have that done. And we wanted to have them a certain size, in October, whatever date. I go, okay, I can work around those two things. And I said, we aren't doing this anymore. So I started to research, and there's people in this room that helped me with a lot of things that I researched, and some that aren't here. And so we started to research that and decided that our optimum day, if we could calf every cow in one day, would be June 10th. I'm like, whoa, that can't be true, can it really? Because, that's what all the research told me. And I said, well, when do our antelope and our deer have their young? So, I had been paying attention to that ahead of time. In our area, on our ranch, is from about the 5th of June till about the 15th of June, and most of them have them in that time frame. And I'm like, oh, man, I'm not sure I can sell that one, even to myself. But I did. And so we went to May 25th, and we went from March 19th to May 25th in one jump. And I know not all you agree with doing it that way, but that's who I am. So that's what we did. And I always equate it to like, well, if you move 2 weeks for 4 years, it's like water skiing slow, it drags. So we just made the jump, and we had good records. So we took out 40 head of cows that we had to nurse through our barns. Well, they all went through our barns. That was part of the problem. And so they had either bad bags or bad mothers. They beat their calf. They did this, they did that. So we took 40 of them, and we moved them out of the herd. I said, we can't take them to summer calving because we're going to have enough challenges anyway. And so one of my sons says, well, are we going to put a bull with them? And I just said, would you want to buy them if we put a bull with them? He said, no way. I said, okay, we'll just sell them as open cows. So that's what we did. We just sold these 40 as open cows. The next year, we calved them out in pasture. Didn't really know what we were doing, but we soon found out. He was going down to tag them, and he got, after about the 4th or 5th day, he comes back and says, this is stupid. He says, I'm way better off not bothering them. So I go down there and you get them all stirred up. So we learned over a year or two that they knew way more about what they were doing than we did. And so we just started leaving them alone. We moved our date back and forth a few times, and another nugget. So while we were trying to figure out how to get our calving date just right, because we were calving into July then, you put your bulls out this date, and that wasn't good. That didn't work out so good for us. Well, so we moved way back up the first part of May. Well, things weren't quite right then either, so it just wasn't quite the right fit. And I was stewing all this for about 2 weeks. And I went in the house one day, and Lori, my wife, looks at me and says, something's really bothering you. Why don't you sit down? I'll pour you a cup of coffee and you talk about it. I told her my dilemma. She solved it in 5 minutes. I kid you not, none. I said, could that have been that easy? So the answer she gave me was, you don't want to calve in July, so take your bulls out so they're done on the 25th of June. You don't want to calve the 1st of May, so put your bulls in that they start calving the 20th or 25th of May. Not that hard. I said, yeah, but the bulls are only out there for a little while. So that's what we've been doing. And it's beautiful. You know, I wouldn't do it any other way anymore, unless something prompted me to. But so don't short the people in your life because they can see things that you can't see. It's just the way it is, right, Jim? Yeah. And so, so these were some of the things that we had to work through as we made this transition. And yeah, go ahead and move the slides a little bit. Yeah, there's a good thought. I like that. You know, if you switch an apple, you both just have an apple. But if you switch an idea, and that's what a lot of you have done here for me, is given me ideas when we made transitions, and so it was successful. I hope I can share some ideas. If I don't do anything but change your way of looking at things, then I've been successful. Because that's the key thing. That's what we had to fight, was our mindset, our mind change. If we could open up and change our minds, then we could accomplish things. Yeah, and so education became really important. I become an avid reader. I've got probably 6 books at home. I read a lot of them. I've read probably 30 books or 40 on ranching and being successful and soil health and those things. But I've got probably 6 of them that I've told my kids this, that if you read these 6 books, you could be extremely successful in the ranching business if you followed what was in them. So I become an avid reader and went to grazing school and went to Ranch for Profit in 2012 and was very helpful. Went to holistic management, went to one taught by Josh Dukehart and then Randy Holmquist. So you do have to ask some questions before you make these transitions. What do you want to do with your land? Yeah, you know, if you don't want to farm anymore, what would you do with it? So you do have to ask some of those questions. Do you want to hay it? Do you want to bale graze? You want to do custom? You want to run stockers? You want to run cow calf? You want to do hunting, wildlife? Have a pioneer spirit a little bit. So we do all those things, and so and we do more things than just those. We've learned to concessionize. I don't know if that's a real word or not, but and that is to just take our resources, pull them all together, and then dream about what we could do with them. And this has been phenomenal to see all that's available if you allow yourself to do that. It's like sitting under the shade tree by yourself and just thinking about what you could do. And so we lease out our grain bins to our neighbors that still farm, and that supplies feed for our chickens because they're really messy when they unload grain. And by the way, so now our most time-consuming enterprise is our chickens. Yeah, I spend more time. I don't say that. So these fields that you're seeing here in these pictures, and I'll show a couple more. I think this was 4 years after we planted them. This was farm ground 4 years ago, where we were raising wheat and all those things that we raised, and wheat, sorghum, oats, sandgrass, sunflowers. We didn't raise corn. Was the only thing we didn't raise, and so that's what it can look like in just 4 years or less. And the boy standing on his horse is now 6'4", and that's our daughter too. You can go. You can move to a different one. And we do hunting. We have a hunting enterprise. It's more just to build relationships with people than it is lucrative, but it's okay. So those were things that we used to do, and then we were putting tremendous amounts of fertilizer and chemicals and insecticides on our cattle, and you name it, we were doing it. We were spraying everything that needed to be sprayed when it needed to be sprayed, and that's why our expenses were so high, because we were just doing all the things that we were expected to do, what we'd done all of our lives, and we were writing out big checks. So the things that we quit doing were way more impactful than anything that we started to do. So we quit We quit putting fertilizers out. We putting chemicals out. We quit buying insurance. We quit paying, and this is another part of the equation that I'll talk about. So there was the biology, the environment, the finance, the people. And I thought, I thought the people was going to be the hardest part, but it turned out to be a blessing, the people part. And the finance was the one that really, really fooled us, because we were, and I said this out to Grass-Fed Exchange when I was speaking out there, and Jeff, I think you were there and heard that. I said, when you're in debt up to your eyeballs, it's hard to help anybody else. And I didn't no more say that, then it turned around and looked right at me, because that's true. And we had been changing that. And so what am I doing today? Well, I'm doing my best to help the people around us. And like I said, being generous is probably the most profitable thing you can do, is to be generous. So having said that, one of our goals was to get my parents out of debt before they died. Short term, intermediate term, and long term, and then to start on ourselves, on our own business. Short term, intermediate term, and then think about long term. So I would have never dreamed that we did that in the first 2 years. We got my parents out of short-term debt, out of intermediate debt, and long-term debt, we'd taken it over, so we got them out of that. So, and they were like kids in a candy store. They're like, man, they couldn't believe it. They had no debt, they had no responsibilities, they had a guaranteed income every year, they were gonna get their check twice a year, and they were living like kings and queens. I mean, it was great. It took my dad a couple years to see it, but after he saw it and grasped onto it and started challenging me to move forward faster, then he started saying, we should have did this years ago. I'm like, well, you only know what you know when you know it. So, yeah, so some of the things that we started to strategize was, what do we want to do with our land as far as our grazing techniques? So one of them was, we wanted to graze our grass up during the growing season, okay? So we wanted to capture all the rainfall that would come. We didn't want it to wash down to our neighbors or on down to the Missouri and on down to the Gulf, okay? So we wanted to stop that. We wanted to catch all our snow and keep it, and we wanted to catch all of our neighbors' snow and keep it. So that was some of our strategies of growing grass. So in 2012, kind of kick-started this when we got really dry, and I went into the NRCS office, and Ryan Willert was in there, and I said, hey, Ryan, it's really dry, and what am I going to do here? You got any thoughts? And Mitch Faulkner happened to be in the room. And I don't know how you know Mitch Faulkner, but I'm telling you what, this guy's a genius with his computer and everything. He says to me, we had all kinds of records, and we had them in there. Am I going over on time?
You got a few minutes left.
Okay, I'll talk fast. Laura? I'll talk fast. So he put all this stuff in. He says, I can take you clear through the year if you're willing to put all your cows in one group and run them that way. 2 days on this one, 2 on that one. And my dad, who was progressive and on the NRCS board for 50 years, really, he'd already set our pastures up, so they were kind of set up that way. So, and then we got into the poly wire and cross fence them and all that. So in 2012, we did that. We put all of our cows in one group. Water was the constraint, but we worked through it, and they were on every pasture for like 2 days, and 2 days, and 2 days, and 2 days. And we have over 100 pastures. So, on 8,000 acres. So that's a lot of small pastures. So we did that, and we went through all of them. And so people were going by and saying, man, can we lease your pastures that you're moving out of? Like, no. So it was really that way. I mean, so we were able to make it through, and it really taught us some things. The power of commingling your herds together. So that's something that we fight yet, is having too many herds. I mean, it's just hard not to. You got this and that and the other thing, and just putting them together and keeping them together is hard. So, okay, go to the next one. Yeah, and we collaborated with Game and Fish and NRCS, and they helped with some of our higher diversity plantings, you know, where we went over 20 species. You know, we collaborated with them. Most of the 5 to 7 to 9 species, we just did them ourselves. We planted them ourselves. And so a lot of people put a lot into what we did, and it's what really made it successful. And so everybody else can get the credit. So yeah, I told you about the calving date, the grazing longer throughout the year. So we started bale grazing shortly after that, and we just decided that we could cut down a lot of expenses by leaving our hay where it fell out of the back of the baler, and just move our cows and strip it with poly wire. And we found out that 3 days was a magic number for us, and we moved them every 3 days. Okay, so I'm going to go through these nuggets really quick. I probably touched on a lot of them. Build relationships. Parents, siblings, children, your lenders, your accountant. Outgive each other. Build trust. Be positive. Speak life into each other. Don't be negative. Don't speak death into each other. Speak life into each other. It's critical. Get the big things right. The details will follow. Don't spend too much time on the details. Spend your time on the big things. That's where the impact is at. That's where you'll move forward the fastest. End up in good places by default. We didn't even know that was possible. That's what we started to do. We started to end up in good places by default, because when we lined up everything properly, our resources with our environment, then things started to fall into place, and we ended up in good places just by default. The easiest money we found out that we could ever make was the money we didn't spend. It just is. And it's not taxable. I mean, that's just, so a question we always start to ask ourselves, and we still do, when we deviate from it, we get in trouble, and that is, can we solve this problem without spending money? So that's one of the big things that we ask ourselves. Can we turn this problem into an opportunity, which we've done that several times. So we get up against a problem, and we ask, how can we solve it without spending money? And then we say, well, wait a minute, let's just turn it into an opportunity. So that has happened up. And so sometimes it ends up with having a new enterprise that we weren't expecting by default. So yeah, what we stopped doing is more impactful than what we started doing. We cut out line items rather than cutting down on them. Surround yourself with the right people. That's good. Educate, read. Information is powerful. Be strategic. I told you about, you know, some of the things we did to be strategic for my dad, but we were strategic in other things as well. And he would say, shouldn't you be selling those drills that are sitting across my yard? Because he loved his drills, and so we parked them across the yard so he could look at them. And one day he says, aren't you about done with those? They've been sitting there for 6 months. I'd say, yep. That's all I needed to hear. I was waiting for him to tell me that we need to sell the drills. And he said that about other pieces of equipment that we'd park across the yard, and I knew we were done with them, and I'd wait for him to tell me, shouldn't you be selling that? And I'd say, okay, it's time to sell it. And then we started to, he said, shouldn't you be planting these fields along the road? Shouldn't you be getting them planted back? I'd say, yep, that was the key. So he was ready. I want to be respectful for them, take them on the journey with us, because they were the ones that built it and put us in a place to do this. So we wanted to take them on the journey with us. Thankfully, they're still with us. They still live in their home across the yard and down the way. And so I still have coffee with them every morning. And then if we're going to make a move or spend money, does this take us closer to our goals or further away? And that's a key thing that we still ask ourselves. And every once in a while, we'll do something that'll take us further away, but not very often. So thank you.